Victor, as the child later became known, was likely born around 1788-1790 near Lacugne in France, and was either abandoned or lost in the nearby woods sometime between 1795 to 1797. He was spotted in the woods in 1798 and captured briefly, escaping for a year before being captured again for a week in 1799. On January 9, 1800, he was captured once more and cared for there by the locals until August, when he was sent to the Institute for Deaf-Mutes in Paris. There he was evaluated by many of the most prominent Frenchmen of the day, such as Philippe Pinel and Rochambeau Sicard. The individuals there praised him to be a horrifically savage creature, incapable of using almost any sense. Aside from having basically no discernible cognitive ability, Victor was initially assumed to be deaf. He responded to absolutely nothing, not even loud, sudden noises, except for sounds of interest to him, such as the cracking of his favorite nuts. Unsurprisingly, he possessed no capability of speech, uttering only guttural noises. His senses of touch and temperature were no better developed. Victor had no qualms about picking hot potatoes out of a fire and eating them before letting them cool, and running outside naked in the middle of winter seemed to be a source of pleasure rather than pain. Cleanliness was a concept beyond him, as demonstrated by his willingness to eat raw, dirty, or otherwise foul food with an unbridled voracity and tendency to urinate and defecate on himself. Given all these underdeveloped features, it came as little surprise that Victor had no socialization skills. Indeed, Victor cared nothing for people and was happiest left alone. People were merely objects to him, existing solely for help in obtaining things he wanted, and should they not serve any real purpose to him, almost always ignored. Given this, Pinel, a well-known physician specializing in the mentally ill and retarded, deemed the boy retarded. Clinging on to the idea of the noble savage, he asserted that the child was, in fact, not feral at all, but just another incurable idiot, like the many he saw at the asylum he ran in Paris. Sicard, the master of the Parisian Institute for Deaf-Mutes, briefly attempted to teach the boy and enroll him in the institute, but soon found him unteachable and left him to wander the campus of the institute with no instruction. However, the young 25-year-old physician Jean-Marc Itard took issue with Victor's diagnosis and vowed to civilize the boy the experts had deemed a hopeless case. A strong believer in Locke's popular tabula rasa, Itard felt that the effects of Victor's unfortunate childhood could be reversed and his mental faculties restored if Victor were only taught in an effective manner. With this philosophy in mind, Itard took Victor into his home and set up an education program focused on expanding his senses, increasing his dependence on other people, teaching him to speak, enhancing his cognitive abilities, and giving him the ability to interact with other people. With the help of Madame Guérin, a local French woman who served as Victor's caretaker, Itard would work with Victor for 6 years. The supposedly unteachable Victor would eventually make great strides and surmount many obstacles in his social and cognitive development under his tutelage. However, to his immense and obvious disappointment, Itard would never be able to return Victor to any degree of normalcy. The first task Itard tackled with Victor was that of sensation and perception. Victor was wholly unable to appreciate or even discern the difference between sensations reacting in the same way to differing temperature and sounds, and apparently having no threshold for pain. To remedy this, Itard and Guérin would subject Victor to long, hot baths for several hours a day, every day, and massage him while cleaning him. Over the course of 3 months, Victor began to finally differentiate hot and cold, and with this discovery came a literal explosion of other development of the senses. He began to insist on his bath being the appropriate temperature, ceased wetting himself at night in favor of being dry, began to finally wear clothes, sought and enjoyed physical affection, and, most importantly, began to sneeze and cry for the first time. Following the enhancements of Victor's sensation, Itard began work on his speech. As Victor seemed almost deaf to the human voice, Itard first began with training Victor to discern individual phonemes. Victor took to this instruction quite quickly, though his recognition of these phonemes did not translate into his ability to form them himself. Indeed, Victor could only ever articulate the sounds O, li, la, and dieu, leaving his actual vocabulary at a pitiful 3 words: eau, or water, eau Dieu, or God, and lait, or milk. Itard was delighted in particular at Victor's ability to say lait, as he initially believed that Victor, who tended to first say the word when being presented with milk, was attaching significance to the word. However, it soon became apparent that "lait" was in fact a sound Victor made in response to the milk, and hence would not ask for milk using the word, or recognize that it even meant milk. Victor would later begin saying "lait" in response to many things that made him happy, or even simply saying it at random. Itard, who had placed such emphasis on speech in Victor's development, finally reluctantly gave up teaching speech to Victor after several years, as it eventually became readily evident that Victor could neither make most sounds nor attach any semantic meaning to the sounds he could produce. Following this defeat, Itard turned his focus onto the written word. This attempt was initially met with frustration, as Victor could not tell the difference between the letters' shapes, and therefore could obviously not attach semantic meaning to them. Itard thus introduced physical reproductions of the most elementary shapes, and worked with Victor until he could discern the shapes, and then more complicated shapes such as letters. Victor quickly grasped the concept of spelling together letters as given by Itard, and was able to attach semantic meaning to at least the written form of "lait." However, again, Victor's abilities were limited, and Itard supplemented with visual signs and pictures of things to get ideas across to the boy. Despite all of Victor's intellectual limitations, Victor made great strides in socialization. Contrary to the aloof, egoistic manner Victor had initially presented when he first came to the Institute of Deaf-Mutes, the Victor that emerged under Itard's care was empathetic and interested in people. The same boy who sat by himself and only interacted with people when hungry or tired was undeniably attached to both Itard and his caretaker, showing shame and guilt when punished but utter and expressing happiness at their return. When Victor once ran away for 2 weeks, he burst into tears at being reunited with his caretaker, and after cautiously trying to ascertain the sterner reaction of Itard, he cried and hugged him upon reunification as well. He also developed an ability to feel empathy, which was most poignantly shown following his caretaker's Guerin husband's death. Accustomed to setting a certain number of plates on the table for dinner every day, Victor set out a plate for Guerin's husband as usual, but following Guerin's bursting into tears, he wordlessly took away the plate and never placed the plate on the table again. For a child so hopelessly underdeveloped in all other aspects, Victor's ability to sense that something was wrong was truly momentous. Unfortunately, after 6 years of working with Victor, the once hopeful Itard finally had to concede that he had achieved the most he ever would with Victor. Despite tens of thousands of hours of work with Victor, Victor seemed to have reached a plateau in development and was as incapable as ever of being able to speak or at least reach some degree of normalcy. Nonetheless, Itard still hung on to his environmentalist ideology, feeling that if he had only begun work with Victor a few years earlier, he might have been able to reverse Victor's poor upbringing. He left Victor in Guerin's care and continued with his research of death. Victor never made any further progress, instead quietly living with Guerin until his death at age 40 in 1828. In his later years, Itard would change his mind about Victor and call himself a fool for ever thinking he could have cured Victor of his retardation. Itard was not alone in criticizing his work with Victor. Many reading his work since have questioned why Itard never tried teaching him sign language, which Itard obviously knew fluently as an educator and researcher of the deaf, to the mute Victor. Several modern psychologists have also opined that Victor was not in fact feral but mentally retarded, psychotic, or autistic, and was abandoned in the woods because of this. As Roger Shattuck notes, it was not uncommon for French families to abandon their mentally handicapped children in the woods, and there was a persistent rumor going around in Lacan, France, that a local family had abandoned their child in the nearby forest because he was mute. Victor's thin scar across his neck is testament to some human contact, undeniably the result of a murder attempt. In any case, critics agree that Victor had been in the woods in complete solitude for several years. Itard's work had great ramifications for psychology, philosophy, linguistics, and special education. Most obviously, the idea of the noble savage died along with hopes of curing Victor. If anything, Victor proved Hobbes' opposing theory that man is disgusting, selfish, and crude without society correct. Less obviously, Itard's limited progress with Victor ignited interest in the teaching of the mentally handicapped. Victor made it clear that although faculties might be limited, a person of deficient intelligence can still be taught rudimentary concepts. Techniques Itard devised to teach Victor are still used today in both special education and in Montessori schools worldwide. Finally, Victor served as one of the many testaments to the future critical period theory of linguistics, which asserts that children who are not exposed to language after a certain point in development will never develop any language ability. The education of Victor may not have been a success, but his legacy continues to affect psychology today.